Sabbath, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to all of our visitors, and I thank you for joining us to worship today. So you may all be somewhat surprised, as this is the first time I'm actually up here, but I'm sure you all find it a little bit funny to know that I'm the most surprised. About a week ago, I was upstairs in my room, minding my own business, and then I heard my dad from downstairs, "Miro, you're preaching in about 2 weeks." And I'm like, oh, okay, he's just joking. So, I forget about it. The next day, I walk up to him, and he's like, "Oh no, I wasn't kidding. I'm serious, you are." So then I was like, oh no. But here I am, and today I'm going to discuss a topic that I feel is of high importance today, and it's compromise. So what exactly is compromise? Well, there's a couple of definitions, but the one I'll be focusing on today is the one that says to accept standards that are lower than is desirable. Throughout the Bible, there are numerous instances of compromise, but first I would like to tell you why I chose on this topic. So, some time ago, I was reading something very interesting, and it involved a cell, and inside the cell is DNA, and protecting the DNA every time the cell divides are telomeres, and their sole job is to protect the DNA. However, every time the cell divides, these telomeres get shorter and shorter and shorter until they disappear, and then the DNA itself gets damaged. Eventually, the DNA itself becomes so damaged that the cell just dies off. Remember that, because it's going to be relevant later. And for some reason, this interesting fact caught my attention because it made me think about the sneaky way compromise, when allowed in our life, corrodes on our spiritual walk, weakening our potential, and it may even lead us to spiritual death. The first example of someone who compromised that I'm going to talk about involves Solomon. So he was known as the wisest man to ever exist, right? I mean, that's what God gave him. But would it interest you to know that he was also pretty foolish? Okay, so what exactly did he do? Despite his direct link and gift from God, he later compromised the truth by tolerating paganism and even later embracing it. Amen. We learned from that Bible that Solomon started as a humble servant of God. In 1 Kings chapter 3, verses 7 through 8, we read, "Now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king instead of my father David. But I am a little child. I do not know to go out or come in. And your servant is in the midst of your people whom you have chosen, a great people, too numerous to be numbered or counted. Therefore, to give your servant an understanding heart, to judge your people, that I may discern between good and evil. For who is able to judge this great people of yours?" Did God answer his prayer? Yes. Solomon got the discerning mind. And because of what he said, this pleased God, and that is why he got his wisdom. And over the years, as Solomon gained political influence and his treasury, my father is telling me to slow down a little bit. All right, I'll try my best. Over the years, Solomon began to trust more in his wealth and political power rather than God. As he accumulated himself in influence and his treasury got larger and larger, he began to forget God, and instead, he gained an absolutely incredible harem of over 1,000 women. Okay, 1,000 women. Now, I have my mom, and that's just one. I don't know how you could have 1,000, and then that would just be crazy. But among those women were women from those nations that God had specifically warned against the Israelites from mingling with. In 1 Kings 11 through 2, in 1 Kings chapter 11, verses 1 through 2, it says, "But King Solomon loved many foreign women, as well as the daughter of Pharaoh, women of the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites, from the nations of whom the Lord had said to the children of Israel, 'You shall not intermarry with them, nor they with you. Surely they will turn away your hearts after their gods.' Solomon clung to these in love." And what happened from there? "And he had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines. And his wives turned away his heart. What did God say that those women would do to him? It said that they would turn away his heart. And what happened? Turned away his heart. For it was so, when Solomon was old, that his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not loyal to the Lord his God, as was the heart of his father David. It's incredible. His father was a man after God's own heart, and his son betrayed God effectively. And Solomon didn't just stop at having 1,000 women with him. He went even further. In 1 Kings 11, verses 7 through 8, it says, Then Solomon built a high place. What is a high place? A temple, pretty much. For Shemash, the abomination of Moab, on the hill that is east of Jerusalem. And for Molech, the abomination of the people of Ammon. And he did likewise for all his foreign wives, who burned incense and sacrificed to their gods. So not only did Solomon have women and welcome them, he embraced their religion. He built temples for them to please them. At this point, he had completely forsaken God. And Ellen White talked about this a little bit. And she said in Prophets and Kings, page 55, so gradual was Solomon's apostasy that before he was aware of it, he had wandered far from God. Almost imperceptibly, he began to trust less and less in divine guidance and blessing, and to put confidence in his own strength. So it was imperceptible. He himself didn't even notice. And this goes into the thing where a lot of people say, well, it's just a little bit more than what was previously accepted. Could it do any harm? And that's the logic that Solomon probably followed until he repeated this process over and over and over again, until eventually he was so far from God that God really didn't recognize him anymore. And this angered God. So here's what he did. Therefore the Lord said to Solomon, because you have done this and have not kept my covenant and my statutes, which I have commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom away from you and give it to your servant. Because Solomon disobeyed God and compromised his standards in exchange for earthly pleasure, his kingdom was torn away, not from him, but his son, and given to someone else instead who would be more loyal. And was it worth it in the end? I would think not, and Solomon didn't either. He said in Ecclesiastes 1:14, I have seen all the works that are under the sun, and indeed, all is vanity and grasping for the wind. Now, when I hear the term grasping for the wind, I think of a laser pointer. You know, if you have a cat or a dog, and you start pointing the laser pointer, and they'll try to get it, maybe, and they never will, that's like grasping for the wind. You can't get it. And it irritates them, it frustrates them, but sometimes they can be so consumed with it, they don't even realize what it is, just the light. Another famous example of compromise which nearly cost that person his eternal life is Samson. So Samson, well, what was so special about him? He was very strong. In fact, he was so strong that no human could defeat him. And as a result of that, he slowly turned away from God and rather believed in his own strength and just searched to please himself and give glory to himself rather than God. It says in Judges 16, verses 4 through 5, Afterward it happened that he loved a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. And the lords of the Philistines came up to her and said to her, Entice him, and find out where his great strength lies, and by what means we may overpower him, that we may bind him to afflict him, and every one of us will give you 1,100 pieces of silver. Now the trap was set. Samson was in love with Delilah, and therefore he could be manipulated by her or weighed down, as was the case. So immediately, Delilah, with promise of riches, began her mission, telling Samson, Please tell me where your great strength lies, and with what you may be bound to afflict you. And Samson said to her, If they bind me with 7 fresh bowstrings, not yet dried, then I shall become weak and be like any other man. You know, it amazes me that he even bothered to answer her, because I assume he just thought, oh, I'm so strong, I can handle it, I'm also smart, I'm never going to tell her what. So I looked for a second opinion, and here's what Ellen White said about it. The Israelites who could not overcome by the arms or by the enchantments of Midian, fell a prey to her harlots. Such is the power that woman, enlisted in the service of Satan, has exerted to entrap and destroy souls. It was thus that the children of Seth were seduced from their integrity, and the holy seed became corrupt. Thus Samson betrayed his strength, the defense of Israel, into the hands of the Philistines. Patriarchs and Prophets 457. So because Satan had tried over and over again to defeat Israel, and it just didn't work, he switched tactics, and he waged a more guerrilla warfare on Israel with women. And in his trust to destroy those loyal to God, he did employ women to seduce Israel. And I like how Miss White described it. She described it that Israel became slaves of passion. Eventually, what happened to Samson? Well, he gave in and told Delilah the secret of his strength. And how did that turn out for him? In Judges 16:21, it tells us, "Then the Philistines took him and put out his eyes, and brought him down to Gaza. They bound him with bronze fetters, and he became a grinder in the prison." So he traded God, for some earthly pleasures. And how did that turn out for him? It didn't turn out well at all. He was tortured and mocked. That's how Satan is. He'll try to lure you in. He'll give you a temporary pleasure. But then in the end, he's going to leave you to die. And you'll have no hope at that point. So remember the cell. Remember the cell in the telomeres? So imagine Samson is the cell. And every time he continued to compromise, the cell divided. Eventually, he compromised so much that it led to his destruction just as a cell dies. That is why you must never remove yourself from God's standards, because every time you do, it'll be harder to fix that and move back up to God's standards, and it'll instead be easier to spiral down into being disloyal from God. But I've gone over people who did compromise, and now I want to switch over to the other side and talk about people who didn't compromise and stood firm, and look what happened to them. So the most famous example of those is Daniel. He was taken away from his home as a prisoner of the Babylonians and almost immediately challenged, starting with the basic diet. As we read in Daniel 1, verse 8, "But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself." So here was Daniel, a prisoner, just conquered. And he was standing in direct defiance of a king because he was loyal to God. Now, if that's not an example of faith and trust, I don't know what is. Because I don't know how many people would do what Daniel did. And how exactly did God react to Daniel's strong faith and loyalty to him? In Daniel 1, verse 20, it says, "And in all matters of wisdom and understanding about which the king examined them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers who were in all his realm." So, what happened? God gave Daniel wisdom, and the king therefore found favor in him and found him useful. And this would come in handy later, because the king had a dream. And all the wise men couldn't determine its meaning for him. Well, almost all of them. There was one who could tell the meaning of his dream with the help of God, and that was Daniel. And after Daniel had told King Nebuchadnezzar the meaning of the dream, here's what Nebuchadnezzar said: "Truly your God is the God of gods, the Lord of kings, and a revealer of secrets, since you could reveal this secret." Then the king promoted Daniel and gave him many great gifts, and he made him ruler of the whole province of Babylon, and chief administrator over all the wise men of Babylon. So because Daniel would not compromise his beliefs, and would not lower himself from God's standards, and he would not destroy his loyalty to God, he was blessed by God. He became ruler over all of Babylon, and most importantly, he became a witness to Nebuchadnezzar and those around him. Without Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar might have never taken note of God. He might have just continued living on, and he would have been lost. So Daniel became a light for others to follow him towards the truth. And this process would repeat itself over and over with various kings. Daniel would be questioned, his loyalty to God tested, his diligence and witness revealed, and finally, the realization that Daniel's God was the one and only God. And a famous verse, which Lucinius read, and I feel perfectly exemplifies Daniel, is in Hebrews 12, verses 1 and 2. Therefore, we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is set down at the right hand of the throne of God. Daniel, he was away from his home for 80 years, and throughout the entire time, he did not compromise himself once. He never let himself fall before God. I would say that's quite a bit of endurance. 80 years is a long time. And another famous example of someone who didn't compromise is Joseph. During his time as an Egyptian slave, he was approached by Potiphar's wife. In Genesis 39, verses 7 through 9, it says, "And it came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast longing eyes on Joseph. And she said to him, 'Lie with me.' But he refused and said to his master's wife, 'Look, my master does not know what is with me in the house, and he has committed all that he has to my hand. There is no one greater in this house than I, nor has he kept back anything from me but you, because you are his wife.'" And at this point you think, okay, so the only reason Joseph isn't going to lie with Potiphar's wife is because she is married. But then, at the end, he says this little snippet. "How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" So the last part of that verse is especially important. When Joseph stated, "How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" it became clear that not only was he refusing to because she was already married, but he was refusing to because that was not his place, because that would be a sin against God. His first thought was God and not the politics of the time. And that shows that he trusted in God more than any human construction. And unlike Samson, he didn't trade God for temporary and dangerous earthly pleasures. As a result, Potiphar's wife rejected Joseph, and he was sent to prison for a period of time. However, this didn't last forever. It was only rather short in the grand scheme of things, and perhaps it was to humble Joseph and prepare him for his future job. And when he successfully informed the meaning of Pharaoh's dream, he saved both Egypt and his own people from destruction in the years of famine. If he had compromised himself and he had gone with Potiphar's wife, he would have almost certainly been killed, and history would look radically different. The Hebrews would have never gone to Egypt, they would have never been enslaved and then subsequently released and then gone on to do whatever. The Egyptians, we don't know what would happen to them. They might have also been destroyed in that situation. So it was very important that Joseph didn't compromise himself and that he stayed true to what he believed, because what if he didn't? That could have had major consequences. Now, I've talked about all these Bible examples of people who didn't compromise and did compromise, but sometimes it's good to talk about people who are more modern. And you may know this person, but I'm going to talk about Desmond Doss. Now, Desmond was a medic in the United States military during World War II. And unlike everyone else, he wouldn't carry a weapon. But unlike other people who wouldn't carry a weapon, at least a lot of them, he did go to the front lines and do his duty to the best of his ability. And people asked, well, why didn't he carry a gun? And that reason comes out of the 10 Commandments, one of which stated, "Thou shalt not kill." So Desmond took this to heart and saved anyone he could, including enemy soldiers, as was his duty as a medic. Despite the ridicule that came from his superiors and peers, his resolve wouldn't budge. He stayed in what he believed in, and he wouldn't wander out of it no matter the circumstances. Furthermore, he would not work on Saturday, and this caused even more resentment from his peers and for his superiors to despise him especially. No matter what anyone did, he wouldn't violate Sabbath, and he was mocked plenty for it. During his time in battle, though, he did prove himself in a time which he saved an estimated 75 to 100 people within the span of a few hours. And that was on the top of a hill, and he was the only one there at the time where he was constantly being fired at by Japanese soldiers. So just there all alone, being shelled the entire time and attacked, he saved all those people. And just before that attack, they delayed that very offensive and let him pray and have devotion with God before. That's how much they trusted him because of what he had shown throughout his time as a soldier. Eventually, Desmond's very presence was a comfort to all the soldiers because they knew he would not give up on any of them. And his witness of the truth made a real impact on those around him. So we've gone from people in the Bible to modern times, but then there's one person that I haven't talked about that is especially important. He's the person that we should look to. I'm going to talk about Jesus. And I've already mentioned this before, but many people will say, well, what's the harm in just compromising yourself once? And for an answer to that, we can also look to Jesus. So remember how Jesus began his ministry by going out and fasting in the desert for 40 days and 40 nights? It was here that Satan began to tempt him. In Matthew chapter 4, verses 1 through 4, it states, "Then Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. And when he had fasted 40 days and 40 nights, afterward he was hungry. Now when the tempter came to him, he said, 'If you are the Son of God, command that these stones become bread.' But he answered and said, 'It is written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God.'" Now, I asked myself, well, what's the harm in turning stones into bread? After all, you need food to survive. So what was the harm? And I'm going to tell you what I came up with. So Jesus knew that if he were to break his fast, he would be compromising himself, and therefore possibly opening himself to future compromise in the future. It was a little harmless tactic, a little Trojan horse, so to speak, that would allow Satan to manipulate him in the future and potentially lead him away from God. Because every time you compromise, it becomes easier to compromise the next time. And Jesus knew that very, very well. He had seen it before. So he secured himself behind the Word of God and ensured that his standards were always kept and never, ever lowered. Compromise in itself is not bad. In fact, there's some situations where it's beneficial. But when it comes to risking your salvation, it's better to just stay to what you know is the truth. So I began by pointing out people within the Bible who had a choice, to compromise or to not compromise. And they chose to compromise. And then they had disastrous implications as a result. Solomon, the wise man who accepted paganism and turned away from God. Samson, the strong man who wasn't strong enough to stay loyal to God. And from there, I identified people who could have compromised but instead chose to stand firm. Daniel, the prophet who kept his beliefs and stayed loyal to God despite kings directing him not to. Joseph, the man sold into slavery by his own brothers who would not betray his master. Desmond Doss, the World War II veteran who wouldn't kill no matter what and saved countless lives because of his faith. And finally, Jesus, the Lamb who came down from heaven to save us and would not open himself to the possibility of sin. Solomon and Samson eventually believed in themselves. Solomon in his great political influence and wealth, Samson in his incredible strength. But Daniel, Joseph, and Desmond gave glory to God instead of themselves. All that they did was in his name, to praise and to witness to others. It was because of their trust and complete surrender to God that they succeeded in their mission laid out for them. We must strive to be like Jesus, to copy his character and follow him. We must not compromise when it comes to matters of our salvation. Or else, if we do not trust in him, we will fail. It is through God that we will be able to stand close to our religious beliefs and not compromise the standard that he has set for us. Not a human standard, the standard that he has set for us. Thank you.